Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and to bring the highest level of competitor to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. All right. Today, we have a special guest, Dr. Todd Lee, which normally it's just Luke and I, but we're so intrigued in such a PED and growth hormone mood that we wanted to bring someone on that's starting to just really lead the front on PED information, which IFBB Pro, Dr. Todd Lee is a 212 competitor, a medical doctor, and also has Anabolic University, where he's leading a lot of great information on PEDs and has been a member around J3 University for a long time too. So, Dr. Todd Lee, welcome to our podcast. Great to have you on.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me on as well, Luke. I wanted to say that I think the biggest change for my approach came from J3 University. That I would say that, and I often do this on my stories, that J3 University is the best education you can get about your body, especially for coaches or competitors, and that I learned more with J3 University than I did in 15 years of higher education.
It's funny because it's makes you take a step back. But I heard that, feel like, man, I did my master's in exercise, whatever, and learned more at J3. It's like you probably learn more about what you specifically want to know about.
Yeah.
But no, thank you. I'm glad that we have that influence, and it's led people to just disseminate the information and make their clients better, make themselves better, and that's always the goal. And you're now spreading that message as well, which honored
Right.
to have you on board doing so. And
Thank you.
You definitely gone deep dive into PEDs, which I've seen you like start popping up more and more in my YouTube feed or Instagram, and just highly going into that area, going into the chemical aspect around PEDs, and kind of coming to your own conclusions about some other areas too. So
Yeah,
we had a lot of questions pour in around what people wanted to know from you, but I thought it would be just probably a good start with just laying, and this should kind of cover a lot around anabolic steroids and growth hormone, because it was far reaching what people wanted to talk about. But I think starting around maybe the core framework of, cycle design, with what does this base kind of look like, and then how are we building into these other compound selections, because that was what a lot of people want to know, is what do you do. So maybe take it off there, Todd, of like where you're at with like kind of a base framework. We have intermediate guy coming in, you're assessing and trying to see, is he meeting this framework of what you would do with him?
it's very similar to what I learned through J3 University. I just almost standardized it because I found that people accuse me of not using nuance. They accuse me of not using nuance in a 60-second reel. Well, I don't have time to do nuance in a 60-second reel. The nuance comes from the personal consultation or the phone call with clients and stuff, where I tailor it specifically to that person. But basically, if you got 30,000 people watching a video, like, you got to be able to have some basic standard framework that people can use as a vanilla, and then they can add mix-ins later, right? So the vanilla approach is start with an HRT base, which I found if you use 20 milligrams of tescipionate and 2 IUs of GH every day, I often see patients having 1,500 milligrams of nanograms per deciliter testosterone. They have under 100 DHT, and they usually have around 40 estradiol. And that 40 estradiol with the 2 units of GH generally gets people above a 300 IGF-1. And that, to me, is good enough for HRT. So basically, you can shoot from the hip, go 20 and 2, and 90% of dudes, they don't ever have to fuck with it after that. They can just use whatever they want or nothing, and that is their HRT base, that you've graduated from kindergarten, and you can choose to go to first grade, or you can stay in kindergarten like Billy Madison. And so then from there, if we had Masteron available, Masteron E, I only like long-acting drugs, and there's a number of reasons for that. If we had Masteron E available, I would say Masteron's the next step, and that you could titrate up Masteron until you're growing muscle. How do you know if you're growing muscle? Your logbook's progressing. If your logbook's not progressing, then you have to reevaluate. Do I need more sleep? Am I eating enough food? Is the training good enough? And that's where you would look at something J3 University and watch the hypertrophy module or the training videos, or I've got a sleep hygiene video on my YouTube channel. And if your sleep's perfect, your food's perfect, your training's perfect, that's a big if, but if it is, then you're still not growing. You can use a little bit more Masteron. Even 20 milligrams a day is enough to push you over that limit, because that's 140 a week. That's a pretty good amount. And that could probably help you grow. Because there's the shortage of Masteron, I had to do some creative stuff. So what I did is I did an experiment with DHB. Is DHB a good alternative to Masteron? Because I know Primo is different than Masteron. Primo is an aromatase inhibitor. As you add in Primo, your estrogen goes down, so which means your test has to go up, which means your DHT is going to go up, which then means you might start losing your hair, getting oily skin, getting prostate issues, etc. Whereas Masteron seems to be a competitive inhibitor or an allosteric inhibitor at estrogen receptor alpha, not beta. So it seems Masteron prevents the downsides of estrogen in men without preventing you from getting the IGF-1 conversion from the GH. So therefore, that's why I like Masteron more than Primo for that purpose. So DHB, I discovered, is not an AI. So DHB is neutral. It doesn't affect your estrogen. DHB is just like Masteron, except it seems to be a lot stronger. And in me, it caused some liver damage. So that's where it gets a little bit more nuanced. And so that's why it gets a little more complicated. So it was safer when we had Masteron E available. Now that Masteron E is not really available, now we get more complicated with using DHB or other drugs as the next step, when you introduce mild anabolics to drive the equation.
Okay, we went from 0 to 100 pretty quick, and there you covered a lot. No, that's good, because it gives a lot of good overview of kind of how the framework would escalate up from there. You have a testosterone base, which, as we know, we want some physiological amount of estradiol as has its neuroprotective, renal protective, cardioprotective, penal protective. Does a lot of aspects for growth as well, right? And so then titrating in more non-aromatizing compounds per needs in the most benign way possible. But going back, like, you have this HRT base testosterone, and where I have people come in that, and I'd like to hear from you, because you probably see the extremes of the equation, because 140 milligram of test is a good general starting point, but some guys have a hard time even tolerating that. That's
Right.
an extreme.
Mm-hmm.
Then we
Mm-hmm.
also have guys that need more and have a greater metabolism of it, or maybe it's just gene changes that cause that as well. So with those individuals, how do you manage them if you have the guy that is uh, more prone to aromatization and wants still this TRT base? Do you lower tests, use AI? Do you bring in Masteron or another compound, and then flip it too? Rather than adding a Masteron, you still just go higher on someone that would have a low aromatization with testosterone.
So I'm going to start with the second one first because it's simpler.
Yeah.
So in someone like me, I have to use 70 to 80 tests a day to get the same amount of estrogen a normal guy does with 20. It could be because I'm lean. It could be because I have a certain amount of muscle mass. My theory, and I don't know if this has been proven, is the more muscle you have, the more receptors you're going to have for androgen receptors in the muscle, because you have more muscle. So it means you can get away with more gear before it starts spilling over into other body parts like hair, skin, prostate, breast tissue. And so for me, I have to use 70 or 80 to get to my off-season ideal amount of estradiol, which, if I was to push the IGF-1 conversion to the limit, that's so much estrogen for me that I would start having fat accumulations in certain locations that won't come off during contest prep in a timely fashion. That it'll distort my look on stage because it'll stretch out my skin around my nipples or my butt. So I pretty much have to stay around 50 is a good amount of estrogen for me off season, not because it's the best estrogen conversion. I can get away with 80 to 100 without having any issues and having the best estrogen conversion from GH to IGF-1. But for the best stage look, I don't want to get a lot of feminine fat deposits. Now, with someone else, I have one guy in particular I'm thinking of. I won't say his name. He has very little muscle and had a lot of baby fat. And so even 20 milligrams of test put him up to 120 estradiol. So in him, I could lower his test and then add in something like DHB or Masteron. Or you could leave his test alone and add in something like Primo or EQ. I prefer EQ over Primo because you get more bang for your buck. With a lot of people, when they're paying for the blood work, they're paying for their GH, they're paying for their test, they're paying for coaching, then you can get 3 grams of EQ for the price, or you can get 6 grams of EQ for the price of 1 gram of Primo. When you like a whole bottle of you get 2 bottles of EQ at 300 milligrams per milliliter, or 1 bottle of Primo at 100 milligrams per milliliter. So at that point, and you can get away with less, like 15 milligrams of EQ per day can cut your estrogen down from like 60 all the way to like 20 or 30. Whereas you might need to use 30 or 40 or 20 or 30 Primo to get the same results. So it's six times the price, and it's half as strong as an AI to use Primo, which means it's really 12 times the price if you're using Primo as an AI over using EQ. And then some people would say, well, the logic would be then why don't you just use Arimidex? And it's like, because you can't really control it. You're taking a half a pill every other day. The blood valves are like this. You'd have to use liquid Arimidex and then use an oral syringe to measure it. And then you could titrate it. But a lot of these people aren't great at math. So that's even more work for them. So I found that EQ has that anabolic component to it, whereas Arimidex doesn't. But Primo is so expensive, and sometimes apparently it's faked. I've never really had to deal with fake gear, but some people say it's fake. So I've always leaned towards EQ and on somebody who is a high estrogen converter versus someone who's a low estrogen converter. You can just drive up the test, assuming that their DHT doesn't get so high that it's going to make their hair fall out.
Well, yeah, that's another conversation too, right? Because we have these choices of compounds that to control estradiol, but they're also going to control DHT to a degree. And we could definitely make a point that the least hair friendly compound is testosterone as it converts to DHT. And the DHT derivatives of themselves are more hair friendly than testosterone would be. Now, I think in this comparison that you made, like I want to use test and AI and control estradiol versus I want to use test and EQ to control or Primo. I want to use Primo. I think that would be a better one.
Okay.
And so one has some competitive inhibition with aromatase with Primo, and also you very well can make a case that it has competitive inhibition with 5-alpha reductase, and in turn would have a lower serum DHT versus just using test AI and driving more test down the DHT pathway. I know you've spoken on this before, so maybe you'd want to elaborate a little bit around that, and because it gets in a bit more. I think people oversimplify some of this sometimes.
Well, all right. So if we inhibit aromatase, then what's going to happen in the test? Well, there's still the 5-alpha reductase available. So it's going to upregulate the 5-alpha reductase activity to some degree. So the best way to look at it is think of a freeway, and the freeway is pretty busy, and there's 100 cars per hour that get off at the mile marker 23, and 100 cars per hour get off at mile marker 24. Well, if you close mile marker 23, you're going to have 200 cars getting off per hour at mile marker 24. So I feel like if you're using an aromatase inhibitor, you're going to have more DHT conversion. Now, I haven't heard about Primo being a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor before. Is it a subtype 1, 2, or 3 inhibitor?
I couldn't say that was going to be a theoretical to bring up. We'd have to look at some like actual. Yeah, I've never seen literature to say that, but that's coming from the idea of seeing people using like a 5-alpha reductase blocker, like a
Mhm.
finasteride, and seeing
Right.
estradiol raise up and shift more that
Right.
pathway.
Right.
However, you get into very genetic, unique individuals of like how much 5-alpha reductase do they have, and what is the saturation point, and then
Right.
also arguing do you have more of 5-alpha 1 or 5-alpha 2, and what
Mhm.
effect that might be. And so I love for you to expand in those areas too, because people are
Okay.
going to want to know about their hair and test
Mhm.
and Masteron or Primo or whatever they're using. Then they're like, all good, Todd. I'm just going to use the AI, but I'm going to use finasteride. And
Mhm.
there's issues around these too, and also tying into your estradiol and GH. So no, that's a
Yeah.
lot, but you're
Oh,
kind of
I'm happy to.
you're going there. So
Yeah.
let's start there about starting with DHT and how
Okay.
these other compounds might have some influence and what effects might be happening for the guys around some side effects they might not want.
So the biggest problem I run into for the last I want to say 12 years is people misunderstanding finasteride. So I'm going to back it up. Proscar was developed as a prostate cancer medication. It is a 5-alpha reductase type 2 inhibitor. They found that that it also results in people not losing their hair. Now they started manufacturing it at 1 milligram and calling it finasteride, and not calling it a Propecia. And this does kind of work, but it'd be like blowing off someone's arm to trim their fingernails. That what you're doing is you're nuking all of the DHT in the body because the 5-alpha sub reductase type 2 enzyme is located at the prostate, not at the hair. So what you're doing is you're wiping out the conversion, 70 to 80% of the body's conversion of testosterone to DHT. So you're going to bring down a DHT level, let's say from 80 down to, let's say, 16, right? That means there's going to be less passive diffusion of DHT into the hair follicle, less binding to the androgen receptor, and less miniaturization of the hair follicles. But that isn't what we really want to do. That the testosterone goes into the hair follicle and gets converted by 5-alpha reductase type 1 at the hair follicle. And that's where most of the actual hair loss is occurring. So the correct way to prevent hair loss would be to knock out 5-alpha reductase type 1. And that way, we're only preventing the hair loss. We're not stopping the other effects of DHT, which is balancing and feminizing effects by the DHT binding to the breast tissue. The DHT also binds to the penis and provides sensitivity. DHT also has some type of neuromuscular activity that I'm not sure on the exact binding site is, but it basically makes you stronger. And so that's why we don't want to just nuke all the DHT in your body. We want to protect your hair. So that's why my protocol for hair is using a derma roller, using topical dutasteride, which is not finasteride, dutasteride, and RU58841, because the dutasteride stops the testosterone from burning to DHT. The RU binds to the androgen receptor at the hair and stops anything from binding to it, whether it's Masteron, Tren, whatever. And you've got the derma roller, which is irrigating it. You can also use minoxidil. You can also use isotretinoin. You can also use ketoconazole shampoo. But if you have a budget, then I would say number one is RU. And if you're running a lot of tests, not HRT tests, you definitely want to use topical dutasteride, which is way more expensive than RU. So a lot of the times people hear a piece of the model and they don't see the whole model. And so it doesn't make as much sense. But when they know the whole model, they realize that there's other factors. It's kind of 4-dimensional. So the last thing I want to say is saturation point. I found in me, I never get over a 175 DHT. It doesn't matter if I'm using 50 tests a day, 100 tests a day, 150 tests a day, 200 tests a day. Once I get over about 100 tests a day, it doesn't matter. My body will not make more DHT. So if I'm going to run 100 a day, I might as well run as more because I'm already at that saturation point for DHT. It's not the same thing for the estrogen. With estrogen, I'd have to control it with EQ or Primo, but there is a such thing as a saturation point for these enzymes. I think in your general population, anything over 600 milligrams of testosterone a week is not going to be more DHT or estrogen conversion. I think most people's saturation point is around that. That's why you hear a lot of people leaning on the 1,000 test base or the 1,200 test based or the 1,500 test base, is because if you're going to cross the 600 threshold, then test might as well be your primary anabolic agent because it's the cheapest.
Yeah, I've noticed that even anecdotally for myself too. Like once I got above a gram of testosterone, whether I went to 1,500 or more, like estradiol didn't change. The only thing that changed it was if I was swapping out another compound that would lower estradiol in turn. And I'm one that's not sensitive to estradiol. Uh, DHT is probably maxed out, but hey, I lost my hair like in my 20s, so I'm
Right.
not concerned around that point. But yeah, I think those are some good points to make, and I think especially you see a lot of people say just throw in the finasteride and then systemically lower DHT. And would you say that at some point your total androgen load can serve all the functions that DHT would have around having an HRT base? You know, like, do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, like, okay, let's talk about the binding affinity of the androgen receptor. All right. So I would think that the DHT derivatives, the reason why they're not going to be as strong as DHT is I don't think they bind as strongly to the androgen receptor as DHT does. They're steric hindrance by the 2' methyl addition or the 2' addition, basically on the A ring, the molecular structure of the testosterone molecule. The primary binding site is the 3' carbon where there's a ketone group. And if there isn't a double bond at position 4, inside the cell, 3 alpha HSD dissolves that molecule. That's why DHT isn't anabolic, is because it gets chewed up by 3 alpha HSD. Putting a methyl group on position 2, like with Masteron, or replacing the carbon at position 2 with an oxygen, like with Anavar, this creates enough steric hindrance that it doesn't get chewed up by 3 alpha HSD. The downside of that is it doesn't bind as strongly to the androgen receptor as DHT does. So it's not going to be as androgenic. Now, there's some molecules like Tren that have the triple conjugated double bond that provides so much stability and it's so resistant that even if it doesn't quite bind as strong, or it might bind as strong, it never gets broken down. So the same Tren molecule can bind to the androgen receptor, go to the genome, initiate transcription translation, bump off of the androgen receptor, and then bind to a different androgen receptor and go through it again. So you get multiple uses out of Tren because it just doesn't get broken down. So the only drugs that I think are going to be as strong as binding to the androgen receptor as actual DHT would be like Tren, maybe DHB, maybe Ment, things that are just going to keep binding those receptors. Now, there's genomic, which we just talked about. Non-genomic is stuff like in the hair follicle that we don't want. Very few things have more non-genomic function than genomic, except for stuff like halotestin has a terrible ratio of androgenic to anabolic. It's like 9-1. It's where we want something like a 1 to a 6, where it's way more anabolic than it is androgenic, like Anavar, like the perfect drug almost. Then Halo is like the polar opposite, whereas on paper is the worst drug. It's just going to do a ton of androgenic damage. It's not going to grow any tissue. Now, do the metabolites actually have a different effect? Maybe. They didn't really study it. It's one of those drugs where it never really went to market, so they didn't really study it that much. But to get back to your point, that if you just saturate a reaction with substrate, you're eventually going to get product. So if you put enough androgens in someone's bloodstream, even if they have a lower binding affinity for the androgen receptor, there's so many molecules, one of them is going to bind, one of them is going to cause the signal to be transduced, whether it's non-genomic or not. So whereas people misunderstand me when I say stuff like Masteron isn't going to make you lose your hair, what I mean is Masteron isn't more likely to make you lose your hair than something else and less likely than testosterone. But if you're taking 1,000 milligrams of Masteron, then yes, that's going to be about as much as if you had a 200 DHT or a 300 DHT in your bloodstream. Again, I also always advocate everybody should be using RU58841, which people don't hear that part because they're only watching the reels. They're not watching the YouTube videos. So they don't get the whole picture. So that's why they get so feisty in the comment section about this Masteron and hair loss thing. Because I guarantee you, all those guys that lost their hair with using Masteron, they were not using RU before they started the Masteron.
Yeah, they're usually. I've done the hooks too, right? I want to catch someone's attention. Masteron won't make you lose your hair. You're like, what? And they just comment right away. Like, no, my hair fell off. Like they didn't even listen to this the reel or watch your long form, right? So you're very easily, and this short form content is frustrating. So
yes, yeah.
Luke, did you want to interject with
Yeah,
anything
I think it's an interesting dynamic because people forget that androgens in and of itself is going to be a primary input for this, just like elevation and total milligram load. And like there's ways to manage it, like Todd mentioned with the RU and dermal roller and everything along those lines. I think one of the primary clarifications that I think we should start to progress into is because I know, Todd, you spend a lot of time on the base, but we've got to progress into like competitive bodybuilding and like how we look into progressing this from a total androgen load perspective for the competitive bodybuilder. Because one of the arguments that gets had is like assuming that everything from the base is managed. So sleep, we've got the training stimulus down, we've got all of these variables. For most, HRT test is not going to be sufficient, and we're going to have to bring in secondary compounds in order to get total milligram progressive enough in order to see new limits from a total tissue perspective. And then kind of starting to dive into that, because the management of that does get a little bit, it's not hard. It's just you need to understand what you're doing and the classifications of like how these interact with each other in these drugs, and starting to kind of build that out, because we are going to see so many, like you mentioned, N=1 cases where starting to kind of map out like the progressions of all the pathways that we're going to be using for this would be smart.
All right. So I have a very unique take on this as well. I think that I have a controversial take that 10 milligrams of trenonaphate is a very reasonable thing to use even in the off season. And the reason why is because we're pretty much above the threshold for the anti-glucocorticoid effect, because 10 milligrams of trenonaphate is about 6 milligrams of actual tren. So 5's the cutoff for the nandrolone class to get some anti-glucocorticoid effect. But 10 is the upper limit for neurological damage, or the minimum for neurological damage. So if we're able to ride in between 5 and 10 actual milligrams of tren per day, in theory, we're in a safe zone. We're still in the green. We're not going to get brain damage, but we are going to we're going to take our foot off the brake while our foot's on the gas, right?
Hey, Todd,
we're going to,
just to interject around that, are you pulling that dosing effect from the rodent model Tren studies, seeing beta amyloid deposition, neurological changes, or is that from another data set? Those numbers
got it from J3U University originally, and then I went through
rodent studies,
and then I went through and I looked into it some more. The beta amyloid deposition can be cleared up by sleep, right? And that yeah, so we got some sleep going, we'll clear out those beta amyloids. But I was thinking of mostly the anti-glucocorticoid effect, but estrogen can also compensate for the lack of the glucocorticoid effect too in that regard. So if your estrogen's high enough, it's okay to have more anti-glucocorticoid. But the point is with 10 milligrams a day of tren, nobody's going to kick their dog. No one's going to tell their boss to go F himself. And they're going to take their foot off the brakes, and they're going to get some of the theoretical IGF-1 conversion benefits through, I think, the PK13 pathway. There's some non-genomic pathway that I don't have memorized that the Tren is supposed to work on. And I think that's an interesting thing to add in that can leverage some other non-genomic growth. I think that you can tolerate DHB. DHB might be a good thing to use. If you can find Masteron and Athate, Masteron's a good thing to use. And you might find that you don't need the typical 1000 test 800 EQ. That's the happy meal, that is the bodybuilding happy meal. You could probably get away with using enough test to get your estradiol where you want it for your GH to IGF-1 conversion. Leverage that GH up until the point where it's not giving you any more IGF-1. Introduce a baby dose of Tren of 10 milligrams a day if it's an athate, not acetate. And then you can leverage DHB or Masteron for additional growth. If DHB is too harsh, you have to roll it back. I've never seen someone run into a brick wall with Masteron where it screws up their blood work so bad that they have to reduce the dose. It seems that there's a point where more doesn't do anything in theory, but I think that by that point, if you're not growing, it's not because of the drugs, it's because of the training, the sleep, or the food. I think you made your biggest growth progress, I think, can I talk about this? Can I quote? Okay.
Sure.
Your biggest growth progress, I believe, was 2 years ago when you did 1,000 tests, 2,000 mast. And then halfway through the cycle, there's all this peer pressure about test and Primo. So you went up to 1,400 test, 700 Primo when you filled in the rest with mass, but the total milligrams was the same.
Yes.
And I think you said you didn't grow any better with the test and the Primo versus the test and the mass, but your skin wasn't as dry.
Yeah, that was basically the...
Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. Are you struggling to hit your peak on show day? Feeling lost in the offseason? Upgrade your coaching game with J3U University. Our program covers everything from offseason to contest prep to peak week, all based from real client results. Along with our comprehensive physique curriculum, you'll also get access to our 4 rooms with our J3U team to answer any questions you have, and live Q&A sessions to further your coaching and athlete experience. We are the source of education for top IFBB pros and coaches. Join us to elevate the coaching standard at J3U University. Let's get back to today's podcast.
The end outcome of that, and to further on with that, having done more iterations of this, correlating my estradiol and serum IGF-1 as well, bringing in the Primo, lowered serum estradiol over what I've seen, and my serum IGF-1 in turn. So this last offseason, I'm bigger, so I wouldn't grow quite as much. However, my estradiol and IGF-1 were lower too. So now to go forward in the next cycle would be, well, let me bring tests back up, less Primo, and see the effect from there. Yeah, and more mass. So anyway, not about me, but to this cycle design proposed here. Why does he only use Masteron? You're the Masteron guy. And I know, like, you're like, damn it, that's not me. It's just like, it's a really good tool in the box as a first option because it doesn't influence estradiol much. So, right. So it's a cleaner, simpler way to start a cycle design, right? You have a test and estradiol set with your testosterone dosage. You bring in Masteron to fill in milligram total that you need without influenced estradiol, because that's when it gets messy, right, Todd? I'm going to bring in Primo or Boldenone. Well, then your EQ, your estradiol smashed down, and so now you have to adjust testosterone back up or lower your EQ and then bring in Masteron. And it's like, how do you manage that? So maybe you should touch on this because that's a point of contention that you get a lot.
So I think analogies works the best to teach people things because it's abstraction. So everyone knows that you eat a fixed amount of protein. Basically, if you're 200 pounds, you eat about 300 grams of protein. And everyone knows you eat enough fat to digest your food, somewhere between 5 and 15 grams of fat per meal, right? You don't need more than that. And maybe you do, maybe you don't. But this is like a general rule that people get. Is like you have about 300 grams of protein a day. You have maybe 5, 10, 15 grams of fat per meal. And that doesn't change. What changes is your carbs, right? So think of your GH like your protein. That it's great up to a point. More doesn't hurt you, but it doesn't do anything anyway. And then think of your test like your fat. It's a necessary evil. You use enough of it to get you to digest the protein. Because the test is where the estradiol comes in. Test is if you think of test as only a pro hormone to estradiol, then you need the test to convert to estradiol to get anything out of the GH. Just like you need to add fat to every meal so you can actually digest the protein. Because if you don't have any fat, the pylorus doesn't close. There's not enough time in the stomach for the protein. Not enough acid gets to the protein to denature it. So then when it gets into duodenum, the different enzymes don't cleave it and it doesn't get absorbed through the jejunum, right? They'll be like, what the fuck did you just say? Just play it back. It'll make sense. And then what you do is you titrate up on the carbs to increase your caloric load. And then when you're dieting, you decrease on the carbs, kind of like Masteron. Masteron is like white rice. You can just add it. It doesn't have anything special. It's not like potatoes. It doesn't come with potassium. Masteron is just anabolic. It doesn't do shit other than that. And it just, you add it in to drive the equation. You add in white rice, you add in sets, and you add in Masteron. Those are your three tools to keep turning up the knobs to make the signal louder so that your body starts growing. And at some point, you blew your eardrums out. You got to back everything off. You turn the volume down. You turn the mass down, you turn the carbs down, and you do a mini cut, almost like I call it like a bulk break. Rather than, we got diet breaks. Well, rather than doing a mini cut, sometimes all you need is a bulk break. And then it'll just let your body de-inflame from forcing food, forcing training, forcing gear.
Okay. I hope you'll follow along with that analogy or some analogy that helps them understand this breakdown, right? I think where people might want to go from there with, all right, Masteron's a decent choice to start as you're not having to adjust your estradiol component, but there are like pros and cons to each of these choices. Mm-hmm. And cons with Masteron right now in the moment is, can you get it? And the shortage. Then mm-hmm. Another con that people don't consider is like, can you tolerate injections? This is kind of more of a con with Primo, but I see like, hey, what do you want to choose? I'm not a Masteron guy. I'm just the pro and con list, and what do we end up for that person? So maybe we have this just kind of a breakdown of your choices, Todd, from Mass, Primo, Boldenone. You can use DHB, okay. and actually before we should probably touch on this. The Tren aspect in the offseason.
I was going to say that.
Okay. Before I just, because we're easily jump ahead. You threw a lot in there.
I was going to ask, are you basically banking on the fact, like with that, as you go through this, that the 10 milligrams is not going to see like histamine elevation related issues? Because we're going to see like not only issues from like sleep perspective, we can even see breathing, net inflammation, but also like GI permeability, everything along those lines with Tren inclusion that I can see be an issue. But just touch on that Tren fact on the back end as you're working through these compounds.
Maybe Todd too, like, are you seeing this like more of the advanced guy? Because it's complicating your framework right away, right? If we have our test base, add in the simplest anabolic, then we roll. So go ahead.
Well, the context was Luke wanted to say, what are we doing for actual competitive pro bodybuilders or people who want to be pros? And then I would be like, okay, well, if they're already 100 pounds of muscle, I think they can absorb 6 milligrams of Tren a day without it doing a whole bunch of damage. It's better. I would rather see them using Tren than Nandrolone or NPP because it's less progesterone downsides, less prone for the gyno. And as far as the histamine, I learned from J3 University that a DAO inhibitor would probably knock that shit out, or some loratadine or cetirizine. So chances are people are going to be running either second generation antihistamines or even first generation antihistamines before bed, like Benadryl, to help them sleep, especially if their sleep disturbance is coming from Tren. Then the antihistamine is the logical choice, along with magnesium bisglycinate and melatonin before bed. And you can, people are like, well, you're not supposed to use that much of this stuff. It's like, you're not supposed to use any of this shit. So we got to just, if you're going to be using certain drugs that need rescue drugs, use the right rescue drugs, right? So, and I'd rather see someone, if they're sophisticated enough to do a bodybuilding show, then they're sophisticated enough to use low dose of 4 different drugs to not get the side effects of any of them, but get all the benefits. So the downside to MAST, cholesterol hit. That Anavar is even better than MAST, but it's a bigger HDL hit. All right. But I see an upper limit on Masteron, like whether you're using 50 a day, 100 a day, 200 a day, 300 a day, it's the same cholesterol. Anavar, the more Anavar you use, the lower that HDL goes until it's single digits. So 25 milligrams of Anavar pre-training would be a good thing in the off season, I think, because it's not too much, but you get the benefits of getting that pre-workout oral effect. So that for the context of a bodybuilder, right? So 25 milligrams of Anavar pre-training, the 10 milligrams of a Tren athlete. The downside of the DHB is your liver may not be able to handle it. The downside of Nandrolone is there's a myriad of downsides, but the upside of Nandrolone is it's hair safe. So that's something I only see people come into problems, especially if they're not someone who's like 200 pounds of solid muscle. If they're not 200 pounds of solid muscle, any Nandrolone's more than Nandrolone their body's going to be able to handle. They're going to get gyno. If I have an HRT guy and his HRT clinic gave him 100 milligrams of test twice a week with a half of an Arimidex, and they put him on 100 Nandrolone, dude's got gyno before I ever met him. You know, it's guaranteed. So as far as the Primo, I simply don't bother with Primo because of the price relative to the EQ. If I'm only going to use Primo as an AI and I can get EQ for basically 1/12 the cost, then why would anyone use the Primo rather than the EQ? And I could see someone say, well, I can use Primo as a primary anabolic, but then you've got to drive up the test so high that you're doing shot volume of Primo and of enormous amount of Primo shot volume, and Primo is extremely painful shots. So no matter how you slice it, Primo never does stack up against EQ. The problem, of course, is EQ has limited human data, whereas Primo is an actual pharmaceutical drug made for humans. But if you're comparing underground Primo to underground EQ, then it doesn't really matter because they didn't do these studies on underground gear. So the whole shield, the security people have from using human grade drugs, well, it's only human grade if it's pharma. So it's otherwise it's all underground, so it's all the same.
No, I think that is a great point because even in J3 right now, you can go look. We have our Boldenone pros and cons. So it's a way out of using Boldenone, pro and con. The studies around renal toxicity, they're all in surrogates models of rodents, rabbits, and a lot of them don't have, or they're sort of human study well, but they're also like retrospective studies on total gear use, or they don't have controls. And so it's really hard to pull away. It very well could just be, hey, you took a certain amount of anabolic steroids, and either way, it messed up kidneys. So I think other issues we see with Boldenone that people might shy away is anxiety, or some people want it because of hunger. And I would say both of these issues come from the mismanagement of estradiol. And because if people aren't aware, like estradiol has a role in appetite suppression through hypothalamic regulation. And when ET drops too low, the brain sees less satiety signal and hunger increases. So what you have with Boldenone is, man, people slash their estradiol pretty hard. And you might see a rise in hunger just from that. With estradiol, it's like a U-shaped curve as well. If estradiol gets too high, there could also be some dysregulation appetite too. So a hunger signaling could be a sign that estradiol is not in the sweet spot. If you're using Boldenone, you notice like this, oh, my appetite's higher. You might actually have estradiol too low, and couple that with like my joints feel terrible, or you have like high anxiety, and that very well could be around the estradiol component too. So I think the problem with EQ is not looking at lab work and being able to adjust your dosage and utilize it. And that's also probably where you could have more risk for neurocognitive issues, renal issues, and cardioprotective issues from low estradiol. Would you agree around those statements, Todd?
Absolutely. I think that I'll even take it one step further. This is my pathophysiology model for why people think it hurts your kidneys. All right. So it drives down estrogen, which no one really seemed to know until a couple years ago. So no one really approached this. They used EQ at 800 milligrams a week. They didn't even test your estrogen. And so if you have a low estrogen, you're going to have dehydration, because nobody was salting their water, right? They were just drinking free water and pissing it right out because the estrogen works through aldosterone directly and indirectly to withhold sodium in the body. So if you're not replacing the sodium you're losing from a low estrogen, you're going to pee it all out. And then you're going to have dehydration, which is going to put stress on the kidneys. The stress on the kidneys is going to cause EPO to be released. EPO is going to drive up red blood cell production. The decrease in the fluid volume and the increase of the red blood cell is going to drive up your hematocrit. Then they go to their doctor and the doctor says, you have to give blood, and they get bled and they lose a bunch of blood. And so now their body makes more EPO to produce more red blood cells when really they just needed to be hydrated the whole time. All of this eventually results in glomerulonephritis because you've got increased blood pressure from a sympathetic tone from dehydration and thicker blood, which is then going to blow out the glomeruli. And so you're going to have damaged kidneys, which is going to exacerbate the high blood pressure, and it's going to exacerbate the EPO. And so you've got this downward spiral effect. Whereas if they were simply they only used it as an AI, not as a primary anabolic, none of this would have happened. And again, this is why using a baby dose of 4 or 5 drugs can give you way better results than using a tsunami of 1 or 2 drugs. And you're going to have almost none of the side effects.
Got you. So I guess this arrives at our current situation for some, that Primo and Masteron, just the access in there, or they have access, but maybe don't quite trust their access. And so we're left with like, hey, I have access to testosterone, boldenone. I guess they would have DHB, nandrolone, trenbolone. Like you said, nandrolone's a real mess to manage. It's usually almost off the table for most of the guys. I can't even. I try to justify it, then I'm like, I can't even justify it because it's now unjustifiable of causing more problems to manage. So we're kind of left with just those few drugs. Trenbolone for many could be tougher to manage long term. There could be a question mark of even, hey, does a low dose accumulation over, we're going to do repetitive 20-week off-season phases, is that worse or not as worse as doing maybe double the amount of whatever other compound? So I guess before we rabbit hole down any one of those paths, Todd, back to my question of this individual that has test, boldenone, DHB, trenbolone, nandrolone available. Like, since there's no mass Primo, how do you build out the framework for someone from there?
So in this case, we would use what Dave Palumbo did back in the day, which is we're going to rely on test and EQ, probably a 5-to-4 ratio. And we're going to have a little bit of Tren in there to give it an edge, and 25 milligrams of Anavar pre-lift. And once we hit that upper limit on test where we can't handle any more test, we probably can use DHB. But if you can't handle DHB, then we're going to have to use more test and EQ. And we're just going to have to protect your hair through brute force approach like RU, dutasteride, derma roller, minoxidil, and save up for a transplant.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, I know there's the guys, because I'm one of them, that I can handle a lot of test, and a little bit of a compound that like prevents aromatization could crash my estradiol. So it's like the guy that needs 3 grams, is he doing 2,500 mgs of test and 500 mgs of EQ? And that's kind of the rarity out there, right? But how do you build out someone on the pro that needs 2.5 grams or something, right?
Well, all right. Well, okay. So let's say I was your coach. All right. And I know what works for you because I've seen it work. And I would be like, all right, this worked. We're going to go 1,000 tests, 2,000 mast. And that worked last time. It'll work this time. And if we need to, we can use a little bit of EQ to mitigate some E2. We don't have to worry about DHT. We're good, right? As long as your blood works good, we're good. And then, but let's say we don't have access to mast. In that case, I would like, we don't have to worry about DHT because your hair's gone. So we'll just use more test, and we'll use 2 grams of test if your prostate can handle it. Who cares? Like, if it works, it's cheap, and there's no reason not to. And we can control that E2 with EQ. And I mean, once we're dealing with doses that high, it's risk mitigation, not risk elimination. Like at that point, I have to think. Once Luke said in an interview, it's like, in the end, we're a coach and we're being hired to get a result. So you got to weigh safety versus efficacy. And you have to say, you have to have a very strong talk with this person. It's like, how much are you willing to risk for this show? You know what I mean? And if it's the Olympia and they have no plan B, that they burnt the boats, like they have to take technotolin, so they have to take out Montezuma. There's no other option. Then you're like, we're going to hit it hard and fast. And then we're going to make sure that we're going to clear you after the show and make your blood work look as good as possible before we do it again. And that's why I think these Olympian guys, they only do one show a year because they probably stay off for or close to off for as long as they can, or HRT. They hit it pretty fucking hard for like 15 to 20 weeks. And then they hit it even harder for another 20 weeks. And then they cool for a few, like 3-4 months after that show. And that's the best they can hope for, because they're going to try to rack up as much branding as possible in their 5-year run in the Olympia stage, then pull out by the time that their blood work's too distorted, which isn't the way I like to do medicine. It isn't how I approach bodybuilding. Would rather, let's run you up to the point where you're just above the point of perfect safety, where it like the green, maybe like lime green, not into the yellow, we're in the lime green, and we stay there all the fucking time, and we put on muscle slowly. And then when it's time to cut, since you didn't bulk, you just lean mass builded, we can just put you in a 500 calorie deficit, ideally through cardio, and it'll just pull off the fat. And then when it comes time, like 4 weeks out, now we can get nutty if we have to go for a look and introduce more dangerous shit like Winstrol or something to get a look, a cosmetic changes.
Yeah, I think this is the conversations that are the most productive, because it gets to asking the right questions. I think people a lot of times start at the wrong point. Like they're asking, is this safe to do? Or they're asking like questions that aren't appropriate for what we're actually trying to accomplish. Like that, I think I know which interview you pulled that from, where I said that. And it's like, the questions you're asking are, is this appropriate for the goal set that we have? And then that's where you're kind of going through this thought process of like this N=1. And we can talk like vanilla all day, but this is where we don't have ways of doing stuff. I used to hate, like 2.5 years ago, we used to kind of get pinned with like, this is the J3U way of doing PEDs, right? And it was horrible, because it's like, I've got people in my roster that are doing like the exact opposite of what they were promoting as like the J3U way, right? Because from a logical, like critical thinking perspective, this is what fits the profile of that athlete, right? And so this is where like listening to stuff like this and like doing your research and taking the coursework of like knowing when you plug something in, what all it does, we can actually start to iterate on these processes. And then you look at all these points across the board, and it's like, what is going on? Like, I remember the longest time people would tell me, you don't use EQ. It's like, no, it fits in certain situations. And it's like, I had a guy win an Olympia qualification with it. It's not that it can't be used. Like there's depth to this conversation. And I think when you start to pull this out, this is kind of where the best coaching happens, because we can work in imperfect situations and still create a result.
Well, I mean, people, they're not giving you enough credit, and they're not being like, they don't look at it from your point of view. You're making a documented video course that ideally is going to build your brand as educators. So you have to disclose that this drug is a veterinary drug and it's never been tested on humans, and that it's not the safest option for you to use this drug, because I don't want to see you have to cover your ass, because you do care about people and you want them to be safe and you want to be honest with the material, but you also have to understand that not everyone is going to be at your level. Some people are going to think they are and they're not. And so you give a little kid a knife and tell them to go run around the block with it. At least 10% of those kids are going to have it sticking out of their side by the time they come back to you. So, I mean, therefore, they have to look at it like this is a packaged, publicized document that you're legally kind of can be held accountable for if someone gets hurt. So you have to be as clear as possible when something isn't medical It isn't medicine. It's veterinary medicine. And therefore, it wouldn't fit in your perfect model to use it because it simply isn't as safe as something that's been tested on humans. That doesn't mean you wouldn't do it on the person if it was the right tool. And I don't want to say it's not intended for, but the J3 University is for coaches and athletes, in my opinion, that seem to be at the upper level of the amateur circuit. It isn't designed for Olympians, although John is an Olympian and it works on John what he does, and he might coach Olympians, or you coach Olympians, Luke. The level 1 is called level 1 for a reason. It's not called level infinity.
Yeah. And since you've gone through, Todd, we've actually brought more of some of the advanced stuff in to kind of bat off some of the stamps that we've gotten around your low dose safety guys, and I won't get the result. So that's kind of been built more in, so people have that understanding now. But you're in all the things you've stated, you're absolutely right. People need to understand the decision process that leads them there, and through that of like, hey, as the goal raises, so does the risk, and in turn, you make more aggressive choices. Like that's really the model. And so how far does that model go? Well, as far as you need it to get to within that goal set. Like for me, I want to be like open Olympian. That's a lot different framework than being the 212 Olympian that I needed. And so, we showcase that, and they're all tools along the way of what you need to do to get there. But again, it's a decision process that we teach, not protocols. Everyone wants the protocol, right? And that's why we have to be careful, because if we say, like you just said, Todd, yeah, Trenbolone and Anavar in the off season, we're going to have the new guy like, yeah, I'm going to Tren and Anavar all off season. It's like, no, we don't really want everyone to probably needing to even be doing that, but there's a decision process of when someone might want to explore and do that. But.
And the context was Luke said, okay, enough with the HRT stuff. What about an actual bodybuilder? It's like, well, in that
throw the
case,
hammer down.
This is what I'm going to do. And then everyone's like, I don't want to hear about safety. I want to do what Todd Lee does, but then I want to say, I don't want to be a bodybuilder. I just want to look like one. Because we work this hard for no fucking reason. We just work hard because we hate ourselves. We really could do it easily and get the same results. We choose not to. We choose to do it the hardest way possible. No, the reason why pro bodybuilders look that way is because they're doing the hard stuff, not because they're doing it the easy way. And so one could go one step further and like, if you can't say out of one side of your mouth, all I care about is being healthy. And then out of the other side of your mouth is like, when can I use more drugs? It's like they're contradictory statements. It's like, if you want to be the healthiest possible, then you run HRT, hormone replacement therapy. Testosterone's a hormone, growth hormone's a hormone. Anavar is not a hormone. If you're using Anavar, you're not on HRT. You're using steroids. It's okay. It's no judgment. It's just at least be honest with yourself about what you are. You are now a steroid user. You're in that box. So you might as well compete because you're already lumped in with the rest of us.
We get constant questions in the forum of like, hey, I'm running 1.5 grams of gear, but I want to have a baby. I want to keep my hair, and I want to have perfect libido, and I don't want acne and great erections. You're like, okay, well, you're going to have some issues in those at some point if you keep bodybuilding. It's just going to be a trade-off. So everyone wants their cake and frosting and eat it too. And that's just not how it's going to be if you're going to explore beyond the HRT means. But we're at time here, Todd, and we didn't even get into like there was a whole thing on growth hormone, and I wanted to hit with you definitely. Like I've really liked the conversation around managing estradiol's effects around serum versus localized, and liver conversion, GH-IGF-1, and what is the serum IGF-1 versus localized. So we might have to just do another episode just so
I would check in too. Like I don't think enough people consider like E1, E2, E3 crossing checking for that if you're getting issues as well. Like we could chuck that into that conversation as well.
Right. I mean, my understanding is E1 is 1/30th as strong of a signal transducer as E2. So it's almost irrelevant. But I mean, if you're sitting in an ocean of it, it's going to gum up that receptor. It's going to do something.
we'll save it for another day. But anyway, I know I mentioned some of your where to reach you in the beginning of the episode, and we'll leave it in the description below too. But anything that I didn't mention that for people that want to learn more from what you're teaching or from coaching, where can they reach and find you?
All right. Anything Todd Lee MD. So at Todd Lee MD on TikTok, Todd Lee MD on Instagram. Not YouTube. That got banned. So the current channel is Dr. Todd Lee's Anabolic University on YouTube. But everything else is at Todd Lee MD. Also, toddleemd.com if you want to talk to me, get a consult, if you want me to read your blood work, or if you want me to coach you, or if you want me to do your HRT for you, because I am a doctor. So just reach out and I'll be there.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. And Todd, truly appreciate you taking the time. I know you're a busy coach and educator like us, so we do very much appreciate it and look forward to the next episode.